And we are live. Thank you all for coming. Good evening. And this is hopefully one of the first of many live streams that I'll be doing. Today I'm with Julius Branson, who is on Twitter, made a recent post about Moldbug, critiquing him and some of his ideas. So before we get into the nitty-gritty and the sort of meat of the discussion, Julius, just introduce yourself and say who you are and yeah, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm Julius Branson. I'm just a random with like 300 followers on Twitter right now. Um, I'm working on a project that I call Powerology. I'm trying to build a theory that explains how power is structured. Because the main theories that are out there right now are pretty much just Moldbug and Marx, and I find those inadequate. So I'm trying to contribute to the online right using my brain cells. And yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, Julius Branson. I have like a subreddit. I'm trying to start a book club, but yeah.
Well, that's a pretty good start, brain cells. But I mean, are you familiar with any other sort of thinkers? Like, obviously there are plenty of cultural and power theorists like de Juvenel and even some of the sort of Frankfurt School try to model power. So, I mean, what makes your sort of
Yeah, well,
idea
I
unique to
consider
you?
the Frankfurt School people of kind of the Marxist vein. Of course, that they kind of his acolytes will change a few things, but um, and de Juvenel, I haven't read him yet. He's on my reading list, but as far as I've seen, he's either not very influential or it's just going to be um, even though de Juvenel came 100 years before Moldbug, it's just going to be kind of like the Moldbug school of thought because I think Moldbug read de Juvenel. I know Moldbug read Mosca. Um, I read Mosca's Ruling Class book, and it basically just boils down to legitimacy, and um, it's not much more than that. It's kind of rambly, but it's not bad. It's just not. It's not a complete like system, and that's okay for that book having come out in like the late 19th century. He didn't have all the information that we have now, right? um,
Yeah, I mean, I've only ever seen de Juvenel and Mosca sort of, well, Juvenel specifically because Moldbug, I believe, cites him in one of his blog posts. I see him in sort of neo-absolutist, neo-reactionary circles talked about a little bit, but not really much outside of that. This sort of like high, low versus middle paradigm that I think he pioneered at least. And Mosca, of course, the sort of political elitist school, or that sort of Italian, what was it called exactly? The Italian school of elitism, something like that.
yeah, he was a
Um,
part of the elitists with Pareto and like Robert Michel's.
I mean, these are influential. I mean, Moldbug's kind of like the synthesis of old school divine right monarchy, Austrian economics, and the sort of Italian, political schools. So, I mean, what do you think that your powerology theory is going to contribute to this sort of, model?
I have no idea yet. I'm basically my whole thing is I'm trying to research specific questions like uh, where did wokeism come from? Where did feminism come from? Where did like anti-racism come from? I want to do after I finish reading all these classic people. I have like this huge reading list I'm trying to work through right now. I actually just got finished doing a different project under like a different name that was like a book, and so now I'm focusing on this one full time, and hopefully I'll have it done in the next like year or two. It just takes a while, but um, yeah, I'm my whole thing is I'm like a positivist. I'd want to look at the specific facts and basically just figure out and be able to say exactly what happened, like exactly what people were behind, like which policies, and then infer things from that in general. Where I don't see Moldbug doing that. Moldbug's very vague. This is my whole critique of him. My main critique, since I don't really have any really strong, really proven opinions on the whole powerology thing yet. My main critique of Moldbug is his epistemic style and his methods. I find them to be lacking. I find them to be disappointing for somebody who's writing after the synthesis revolution, which the synthesis revolution is a term I use to describe the fact that we have Wikipedia, we have Sci-Hub, we have LibGen. All of these sources that I'm reading through, they are all free. Everyone can access them for free through the internet. And so Moldbug writes in a way that is kind of similar to like an old like 19th century or before philosopher. And he says that he likes to write this way, and that he doesn't, quote, like empirical evidence that much. That's like a quote from his one of his first writings, his Formalist Manifesto. He says he's not a big fan of empirical evidence. And then in one of his Clear Pill essays, I think, he talks about how he's making a deductive model of where progressivism came from. And it's just like this bizarre essay where he's talking about like the marketplace of ideas, and talking about how, just like this trivial stuff that he's supposedly deducing from like first principles or something about uh, how progressivism is like a beautiful idea that isn't true. And that's his whole shtick. And it's just not very convincing. And it's kind of like, like Mosca was more in the facts, even though Mosca was writing in like 1890 or something like that. I forget when the first edition of his The Ruling Class came out, but it was the late 19th century, and that book is more grounded in like facts and like empiricism. When Mosca was literally writing in the 19th century without a computer, and Moldbug is, has a computer, has LibGen, has Sci-Hub, and he's still writing. He's been doing this for like 14 years. He's still writing these essays that are, very long and rambly and don't cite any sources. You don't learn any facts. It's kind of just like his opinion. And he even says, my answers are long, hard, and very probably wrong. And that's from like one of his writings like a year ago. I think it was the first chapter of the book he's developing on Substack. And it's like, why even bother reading this guy if he's just going to flat out say that in the first chapter of his book? My answers are long, hard, and very likely wrong. And I'm not much of a fan of empirical evidence. It's like, what are you going to learn from this guy? I don't think anything can really be learned from his writings. And so my main point that I'm going to be defending today is I have this list of questions that I don't think Moldbug sufficiently answers. Where did wokeism come from? How does the right gain power? What is good? He never addresses ethics. That's kind of like a side one, but yeah. Who are the people in power, and what do they want? Quite simply, he fails to adequately answer these. Sometimes he provides weak, so-called like deductive conceptual answers, like his whole thing with the cathedral, which really just boils down to a label. Like his most popular concept is the cathedral, and it's really just a label for, I think he calls it academia, the media, and education. And then he simplified it to the media and academia later on. And yeah, it's literally just a label. There's not
Well, he
much to it.
branched out. I think he put the entertainment industry as well as like an update on his blog at some point. But I mean,
Yeah.
you mentioned a lot of interesting stuff there that I mean, I hope we can sort of get into later. But if you want to start with your sort of empirical, you claim that Moldbug's not very empirical. I mean, yeah, I have to agree. I think this comes from his legacy as a poet, right? On his old blog, he'd always be posting his poetry and these little excerpts and that sort of thing. And I think, just the kind of person that he is. I mean, he's an engineer, right? Software engineer, I believe. But a lot of his writing, a lot of his history is very much verbose, and he has talked about this. And perhaps he fails in this regard. I'm sort of fond of his style. Maybe I'm just sort of used to it at this point. But I don't think it's a huge issue, because really, when you're writing history, and it's obviously different for different authors and different sort of fields, but at least really when you're writing history, you're sort of writing a narrative. You have to engage people. You have to sort of weave these facts together. Everything you're trying to construct as a sort of model of the past is an attempt to try to just sort of derive causality out of these random events. So at least from my perspective, I'm a bit more lenient towards authors who do this. I've read a couple of history books who just like in fact, one of the ones that Moldbug recommended, the Puritan origins of American patriotism. George McKenna just sort of plucks things out of thin air and kind of weaves them together, and it's a really interesting narrative. But yeah, as you say, it does sort of fall into this style. But I don't think you really need to be so heavily based in data or studies or whatever. I mean, Moldbug is sort of creating this new concept of the cathedral, which is decentralized, right? It's going to be a challenge for him to find evidence for this because there's no one really looking for it. And it's it's an innovation of his. So I think it's quite unfair to critique him in that regard because how on earth would you expect him to be able to define this informal network of power?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what the question is. I mean, I think he does, define the cathedral quite finely. Um, but my point is that it's pretty much just a definition. I mean, it's a label. It's not really this profound thing. I even use the term, even though I'm pretty hard on Moldbug because at the end of the day, it is just a label. Um, what I do disagree with is kind of the way he describes it, which I find to be not based in reality. And you kind of hinted at this description. He kind of gives this aesthetic about it being like this decentralized mass of, informal power or whatever. All of that stuff is kind of in between. It's kind of like Derrida. Derrida is the first thing I think of when I think of like partly trivial, partly meaningless, partly incorrect. Um, Moldbug kind of goes into that territory when he's talking about the cathedral being this decentralized network of journalists and professors who are just all acting on like individual incentives. Um, he doesn't really define decentralized anywhere, so it's kind of hard to strictly critique the concept of the cathedral being centralized. So I ended up having to define what centralized means, and in my parlance, the more something is centralized, um, the smaller the group of people is at the top of whatever the hierarchy is. So if something's like generally decentralized, then power is spread pretty much evenly. Like perfect decentralization would be no power differentials. It would be like total anarchy among whatever group you're studying. And so, in my parlance, when Moldbug says that the cathedral is decentralized, what he means is that there's this set of people that are in the cathedral. Um, he's relatively clear that this set of people are like literally every journalist, every professor, um, every like actor, all these like bottom level people at these media companies. I argue with a lot of NRX people, and that's clearly their interpretation. Um, Again, it is kind of slippery because Moldbug's writings are like vague and inexact, so people can always say, "Oh no, that's not what he means," whatever. Um, but this is how he's widely interpreted, and this is what he seems to mean to me. And so, basically, I kind of um, just caricature strict Moldbug people by saying, "Oh, so you think the journalists actually rule the country? Like every like bottom level journalist at CNN or whatever actually makes all the decisions." And uh, that's what it means in my parlance for the cathedral to be decentralized is they have equal importance. They're like individualities have equal weight with the people at the top, with the billionaires that own these companies, um, with the like deep state people who, you know, shuffle between being like the president of Harvard and all that, and with the incredibly rich people who make up the people who donate to Harvard and fund Harvard. Moldbug just seems to state when he is talking about this informal decentralized system that like Harvard, the decisions are made like almost democratically, like anarchically, by like every professor, every little professor just kind of is following their own incentives. What I'm saying, no, that's clearly ridiculous. If you look at like the New York Times, I have this essay on my WordPress. It's not on my Substack yet because it's one of my older writings. It's called Centralization and Coordination. I look at media companies to try to test Moldbug's hypothesis, and I find a lot of evidence that no, it's not the bottom level journalists that are making the decisions. They're taking orders from the top down. There's really this very small clique of people at the top, um, like at News Corp, for instance, which is the corporation that owns Fox News. I found this letter from who are the people who the Murdochs, yeah, from one of the Murdochs. He was actually resigning, and in the resignation letter, it's very short, but he alludes to the fact that the board of directors are totally controlling the direction of the company, and that's just normal in this illusion. That's just he just says, "I'm just upset with the direction that the with the ideological direction that the board of directors are taking this company in." And so, that's very clear evidence to me from an insider that it's like the board of directors that's making all the decisions at News Corp, and by extension, all these other media companies, which are by extension a huge subset of the cathedral. They're very centralized in my parlance. They're not decentralized at all. And the power is also formal. They're formally coordinated. That's another term I use. Coordination is how much the people in power kind of influence each other. It's very similar to the concept of centralization. And formal just means that they like put a name on their group. Um, and so when you have an official board of directors, they're like formally coordinated, and it's a very centralized organization controlled by a formally coordinated group at the top. And so Moldbug's, ecstatic about how, oh, the cathedral is decentralized and it's informal and all that. I just find it to be totally not true. And the only way that he can kind of slip away from these critiques of mine is in his vagueness. Moldbug or an interpreter of Moldbug can say, well, that's not exactly what he means by coordinated or centralized. And that's only possible because overall Moldbug's writings are too vague. They're epistemologically kind of invalid, and he maybe never really strictly defines what he's talking about. He just tries to serve up this aesthetic, and it becomes kind of a Mott and Bailey.
Okay, well, I think you're onto something there with the potential vagueness. I mean, Moldbug is not exactly a writer who writes with a certain kind of formation in terms of the way that he structures his essays. I think there's to a greater extent in some of his essays, like How Dawkins Got Pwned. He kind of he writes with more clarity in terms of his definitions and exactly what the point he's making, and you can kind of anticipate what he's going to say next. With some of his writing, it's a bit all over the place. I see that, but I think that the main thing is that you can still have a decentralized power network that has central operations, right? Formal systems that operate within it. Just because the CEO of some company or the board of directors operate in a formal hierarchy does not mean that the whole system is operational, is fully operational in that manner. You have to sort of go back to his writings. I'm not sure if you've read them, but he casts this distinction between type 1 societies and type 3 societies. Basically, type 1 is one in which the state enforces a set of rules or beliefs that the public have to follow, and sort of what, as you mentioned in your blog, Orwellian mind control state, whatever. And the other type of society is the one in which there's a free market in which you can believe whatever you want, and there's a total disconnect between the idea generation system, right? Who is creating the universities and the media, all this, and actual formal public policy and law. And Moldbug suggests that we are in fact a type 2 society in which these sort of information systems dictate exactly how the government works and operates. So I think the important thing there is to understand that by decentralized, it's really about, and I'm saying this, after what you said about, oh, he's being vague and people will just justify whatever. But the point is, it's about the apparent separation of, church and state, whatever these universities and the cathedral and the government, when in fact they are, deeply conjoined, and really it's the universities that are sort of creating policy, and elect officials and the president don't have any real power whatsoever. The fact that bottom level journalists aren't influencing public policy, or even influencing, just to such a great degree, or even influencing the operations of the sort of company that they work at, does not represent very much for your sort of theory, because of course, you're transposing this sort of centralized model onto these journalists. They haven't got to be in control, right? It doesn't have to be this sort of anarchy of journalists all competing. It can be a set of institutions that are just competing against each other in terms of promoting certain messages, and those that are more conducive to power and of obtaining power and of creating these formal connections with the state and with government are going to succeed, and that's what Moldbug's getting at. So I think that there is merit to this idea. There is no sort of top-down central authority in the USA, and I think it also applies to Western countries too, although it's certainly very different across the pond, and Moldbug is obviously writing about the USA. I think that, he's sort of right that there is no central authority that says you have to learn this, or you have to believe this, and we're going to inform the rules of our society. That's not sort of disguised, right? It's not formal. It's informal, and it is somewhat decentralized. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely think that we're on a partially centralized level, at least in my parlance. When we go from describing the cathedrals being run by like the low level operatives, every journalist, every professor, whatever, to being actually decentralized, meaning that like it's a conglomeration of different institutions that are competing against each other, but within each of those institutions, they're centralized. That's definitely like, it's a sliding scale, it's a continuum. So that's definitely not as decentralized as decentralized can mean, and as it's often interpreted to mean by big Moldbug supporters. So I just wanted to point that out. I also, you talked about how Moldbug claims that the academics, the universities create policy. Um, that's one of his claims that has persisted for a long time. I think he totally jumped the gun on that claim. I'm not sure what his evidence is for it. I never see him bring up any evidence, and I'm not talking about scientism. He has to have a peer-reviewed study. I don't see him like refer to any facts or like actual things that have happened to support his saying that the universities are creating policy. I just don't see it. The people who seem to be creating policy to me are the rich, as it looks. And recently I did do a project where I kind of looked more deeply at what I call, or what's kind of commonly called the PMC, the professional managerial class. I define these as basically the paid brains of the rich, the people who control all the wealth. And what I found there were examples where they definitely seem to contribute to policy and by influencing the people with all the wealth who control basically the country's economy, but they're not the main source of policy. And I don't even see Moldbug look at what I looked at. So even to whatever degree he's correct about the people in the universities influencing our policy, um, he really ascribes them a lot of autonomy, and he brings like literally no evidence to the table that I've seen. So I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Well, what I would respond is that I think that, just to be clear here, Moldbug covers a lot of different ideas, and so some of them perhaps have less evidence than you might be expected from a usual historian. So I see where you're coming from, but if I remember correctly, his sort of point about the universities and their connection with government really boils down to the eradication of the spoils system in America, in which you win an election democratically and you just fill the government with your supporters and those who work for you, and in this way you could sort of create this like crony government to administer the country. But Moldbug's argument is that this gradually decayed, and instead what you have is a sort of civil service state in which politics is separate from the civil service, which sort of administers behind the scenes with FDR's brain trust and the Hatch Act of 1939, which, according to Wikipedia, I haven't read much about this, which prevented federal employees from engaging in many political activities. You have this sort of separation in which, true policy is formulated by these brain trust individuals, these sort of bright, smart guys who come from the universities, and they are just sort of, on a one-way track into creating public policy, and those who get elected are sort of stuck, right? These guys who perhaps represent the majority of Americans, who are conservative Christians, they're cut off from policy making, and so you have this cathedral system, which, and this is like the valve, right, that shuts off the democracy from actual sort of administration. So that's his sort of that's his argument in terms of how the cathedral works in that sense. I mean, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, so you're saying that he cited the specific example of the Hatch Act, right?
I don't think he cited it
To
specifically, but he
support.
talks about the brain trust and FDR and his reforms in terms of centralizing this the cathedral state, if you will.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that sounds pretty similar to what I've looked at. I obviously haven't read all of Moldbug. Just to be clear, his style, I wasn't going to talk about like his, aesthetic style much because it's not that important, but it seems to be pretty divisive. Some people love it, which might be why he's so popular. It literally gives me a headache. So it's kind of hard for me to actually read a lot of him. So to be clear, I have read the Formalist Manifesto, the Open Letter to Progressives, um, the Clear Pill essays, which I think there's only 3 of them. He never finished them, and like the first like 3 or 4 chapters of that book he's working on in Substack. So I've leaned towards his more recent writings, and I haven't like actually deep dived into UR um, because really I don't know if I don't know that he can. I just tried to read like the stuff on UR that he puts on the front page, because I don't think it's valid to say that somebody has to read like all 3 million words of this hyper verbose writer before he can be critiqued. But yeah, so I just want to be clear on that. And so yeah, I have heard of these um, cases where Moldbug has actually gotten more into the details. Um, like, I know that he did a thing on Carlyle where he actually kind of approached, a decent epistemology, but my main, like, methodological critique is still, like, especially if you look at his newest writings, it's just there's no references to any historical events anywhere, and I'm not, and again, I don't wanna fall into the, scientism trap where, because I've had people tell me before, "Oh, you just think that he needs to have an official you're just, mind paused by the cathedral, you just think he needs to have a reference page and to cite official sources." I'm not even saying that, I just don't see, in his newer writings especially, and in the main writings that he puts forward on UR, like the Formalist Manifesto, the Open Letter, um, he doesn't even refer to like actual hard concrete events. He's always in this very like kind of abstract space. Abstract is a very vague word in and of itself. I've never heard somebody actually define it. Um, but he's always, what I mean by abstract is he's always kind of talking in this vague way. And so, yeah, on this Hatch Act thing specifically, um, it would appear to me that he has looked at the brain trust, which is a specific case where it's similar to what I probably found in this recent thing that I worked on, where there are these people with power and they're employing these academic types to think for them. And these academic types, what I found is it's kind of like a dialectic when this occurs, and this occurs very commonly when it comes to different policies. And so I'm sure that it did occur here in the brain trust, and that these academic types will actually um, manipulate the choices that they give to their employers, and it will impact policy in that way. So in that case, yes, the universities and the people who dwell in the universities definitely do impact policy. However, I definitely think one example is far too uh, small when it comes to trying to conclude that they are the main like font of power. They are the main font of decision making. I definitely, in what I look at when I look at the brain trust, and when I look at uh, what I looked at in the project that I did, which was it had to do with the Committee of 10, which had to do with the education system. Um, I don't even see the cathedral being like the main font of policy. I see them as being like actually kind of subordinate to wealthier class of not to sound like a Marxist, but like of like capitalists who own things. They own things, and they have like this economic legitimacy, and they have all of this money. They're like Jeff Bezos. They have like billions of dollars, and that's when you have that much money, you can kind of impact, like not just kind of impact, you can do huge things. I mean, just look at Donald Trump. You can literally shake up the country with who you fund. You can fund um, politicians, and really, it's like these brain trust people, these cathedralites, these people who dwell in the universities. They're, like I've been saying, they're employees of these people with this wealth. And yes, they definitely kind of manipulate their employers because they can, because they're literally being paid to think for their employers. But at the end of the day, um, they're not going to be hired by someone who's like a hardcore, like racist, sexist, homophobic bigot, who, and they're not going to be hired by someone like that and be able to manipulate that person into being a shit lib, right? And vice versa. They're not going to be able to be hired by a liberal and be able to, you know, recommend like Hitler right policies or whatever, like white ethno state stuff. Um, so they're going to have to dwell within like this range of what's going to be acceptable to their employer or set of employers. And so at the end of the day, um, they really are only going to explain a little bit of the variance in what's happening. And the people who are hiring them, um, you know, FDR and FDR's moneyed backers, and like Rockefeller in the case of the Committee of 10 and whatever, and Carnegie and all of them, they're really the ones ultimately making the decision. They're going, whatever they are, like their individual essences, that's going to explain the majority of the variance and like policy that's coming out from year to year. Is going to be due to these people with the money who are employing brain trust type cathedralite people to think for them. And it's really the source of like, the organic source of like what's going on, like wokeism, feminism, um, old fashioned progressivism, uh, New Deal, brain trustism, all of that. That's going to be beneficial to this employer class, and it's going to be ultimately driven by them. And I think Moldbug definitely misses this. And again, his claim that it's really all the professors and the people who dwell in the universities. They're the ultimate source of policy and all the bad policies and all that. And it's really just all about the university. No, they're kind of like an appendage of the real class that is basically creating the present order and has been creating it and has been ruling over the United States and assorted Western liberal countries for at least 100 years.
Okay. Well, to start off, I haven't read much of Moldbug's recent stuff. Are you a subscriber to his Substack?
Oh, I don't pay any money. I think my Substack account might be freely subscribed to him, to where I get email
Okay.
alerts. But
Well,
yeah,
yeah, I read like his like first three free chapters or whatever that he did ages ago, but I can't remember much of what they said. They weren't too I don't know, they weren't too insightful from what I recall.
yeah,
But yeah, so I don't really know much about that. But to cover what your sort of main argument, I mean, uh, I I think with regards to sort of capitalism, there's a whole woke capital argument you could make, right? And Moldbug sort of ignores this. He talks about the cathedral and English dissenter, Puritan origins of progressive politics, but he doesn't talk much about capitalism and all this. In fact, he sort of argues that it's part of the reactionary structure of society, which has sort of been critiqued by, I believe, Keith Woods and some other sort of depositionist guys. But I think broadly, it's quite hard to pin it on capitalism that much, because at least from what I see, you have these laws like the Race Relations Act, and in America the Civil Rights Act, that prohibit private property owners to sell to refuse to sell to black people and other sort of protected characteristic groups. And that seems like it's not coming out much of some sort of private company, but just from the universities into the government, and then they pass the law, and this restricts the freedoms of these private companies. So sure, capitalism, yeah, I see where the incentive to grow and expand into more markets and how that might contribute to a liberal paradigm, but I think sometimes it's overstated. But you mentioned something interesting, the Committee of 10. You didn't talk much about it, but it seems like, I'm looking at the Wikipedia page for it, and there's just cathedral bells ringing all over it. Yeah, so Wikipedia says that the NEA, originally on the conservative side of US politics, by the 1970s emerged as a factor in modern American liberalism. While the NEA has a stated policy of non-partisan, it almost exclusively supports the Democratic Party. So, I mean, how do you link this to private moneyed interests? I mean, this seems to me like
Yeah,
it sort of reinforces.
NEO was actually set up by like the
idea.
Rockefeller Foundation. And
I see.
in the early days, like I was saying, they were literally employed by like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and all these old like industrial capitalists.
You have to link me to that, because it doesn't mention it on Wikipedia.
Link you to that? You can
or just yeah, where does it? Where have you sort of
look up like Rockefeller Institute.
But Rockefeller was a Baptist, right? Whatever your argument is, I mean, do you think that he was motivated by material concerns, by religious? I mean, what's your whole point here?
Let me pull up the quote. His main like advisor basically told us what they were motivated by. Quote, and this is on the Wikipedia page for the General Education Board. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from their minds, and, unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, editors, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have ample supply. The task we set before ourselves is very simple as well as a beautiful one, to train these people as we find them to a perfect ideal of life just where they are. So we will organize our children into a little community and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way in the homes, in the shops, and on the farm. So specifically with like funding NIA, my take is that like the rich wanted to essentially offload the cost of job training onto the masses by making them pay taxes for public school. And so that was the whole reason why they wanted to set up like high schools and stuff. And that's basically what this quote I just read is saying, is they don't want to actually make, like farmers into lawyers and stuff. They just want to make them more economically productive via like public school.
Okay, that's interesting. I've never seen this before, so I'd like to look into that. So, yeah, what a material concern is motivating this, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, well, yeah, well, I don't think Moldbug is entirely comprehensive, right? So there's obviously going to be different factors. It's just a matter, and this is the mark of a good historian, is to discern what factors are really important in changing the culture. But this, I don't think it says much to the influence of progressive politics in the USA. I mean, sure, it has an impact on society, but Moldbug is quite clear in his sort of you have a Puritan stock that becomes liberal Christians that manage universities and promote this way of thinking, that goes into politics, and that affects the society through making public policy. So, I mean, that this sort of system, I think, is fairly robust. But you take issue with the Puritan origins hypothesis as well, right?
Yeah, I just find it to be like metaphysical and bizarre. Very generally, it is subscribing to a theory called memetics, which was first put forward by Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene. Um, and that theory basically takes people to be blank slates that can be freely manipulated by these posited like mind viruses that like literally physically exist in your brain. And there's like no evidence that these things actually exist in a consistent way and that they are replicators in the way in which Dawkins stated. And the idea that people are blank slates, freely susceptible to whichever like memes happen to be in their immediate environment is also just obviously wrong. So essentially, like what Moldbug is doing at the very least with this Puritan thesis is he's totally ignoring genetics, and like the inborn impulses of this set of people. Kevin McDonald actually has a very good book that he released like last year on this called Individualism in the Western Tradition. It's not about that one group of people that you're not allowed to talk about at all. It's about like Puritan type, like white people being really into egalitarianism. And I find that to be a much more compelling form of kind of the Puritan hypothesis when you make it organic and you say, like they have this genetic impulse towards this hardcore egalitarianism, and that would still kind of be the Puritan hypothesis when you still put the onus of responsibility on the Puritans and their descendants. But it is different from Moldbug's version, where Moldbug only talks about like the idea of Puritanism, like mutating into like progressivism. That just makes no sense. And of course, like that all being said, Moldbug also obviously misses the other half of the equation. It's not all Puritans, and that's all I can say about that.
Well, I think the Puritan hypothesis, it falls apart a little bit after World War II. I think that the idea that liberal Christians sort of became atheists and retained their Christianity to some degree. I think atheists nowadays do contain some sort of semblance of a Christian upbringing. They still have these sort of core ethics relating to the sort of brotherhood of man and pacifism and these sort of, maybe not high church, but definitely sort of low church English dissenter beliefs. But I think that you can equally argue that they shed their Christianity, right? I mean, this is I don't think anyone nowadays would sort of acknowledge that heritage personally, even if we kind of pull back the veil and sort of say, well, this belief is sort of Christian in its, the way that you think about it, or sort of cultural legacy. But yeah, so Moldbug's sort of understanding of the Puritan issue here is that you have to just get rid of them, right? The fastest way for the dissenters or whatever. But down at Defoe, he says, just do to the Puritans what they would do to you, which is eradicate them, however possible. Make their kids think that it's like weird and creepy to be Puritan, ship them off somewhere, or just put them in prison, something like that. Solve the issue. That's his sort of political solution. Now, I understand.
That's a lot different from the clear pill.
From what? Sorry.
From the clear pill.
Oh yeah. Well, this is all
saying do nothing. I'm not sure. When he changed.
Well, this is Moldbug sort of talking in UR, which is several years ago before he was a face fag. No one knew who he was. He could talk about wanting thorough government in which these people are whatever.
That was before before we know he took money from Peter Thiel for his computer scheme called Urbit or whatever. So it might be interesting.
I mean, in his most recent podcast he did with the Good Old Boys, he vaguely alludes to the dictatorial takeover of the USA, but he doesn't obviously say it explicitly. But I think, you have to, at least with Moldbug, you have to add your own salt, or you have to read between the lines. This is definitely what he's saying, because with the idea, and I think to a certain extent it's true, there is an individualist strain in the sort of Northwest European. How exactly do you contain that? I mean, what's the solution there? I know that some people would go, well, Northwest Europeans, they're more individualist. They can sort of manage a society in which it's more democratic and egalitarian, and you can have this sort of democracy. I disagree. I'm far more cynical. I think that regardless of your genes, there's a I think orderly government is always supreme. But I mean, what do you propose then if we just accept that you can't get rid of these ideas because they're innate? I mean, how do you deal with them then?
I mean, frankly, if the ideas are innate, that doesn't mean that you can't, begin a process of trying to make them less common in the population. And also, subscribe to elitism. So it really depends on who has power. So, um, I'm not calling for harming anyone, but at the end of the day, like if, I provide strong evidence that these ideals are innate, then the first thing you want to do is you want to say like, no, if you're like a Puritan or whatever, like you can't be a professor, you can't be the president, you can't we have to disempower those Massachusetts white people, and we have to abolish whiteness and do all that, and then just say you have to be based and you have to
Well, this is
marry,
the sort of Moldbug
based,
like thesis, right?
yeah,
Continue.
based. You have to like marry based like Southern women or whatever for like generations until like your kids are just all these like based. I haven't read Albion Seed, but so I don't know what he calls them, but basically there's like this based like libertarian strain that this dude posits.
The
Um,
borderers.
yeah, the borders. So basically the borders have to take over and just disempower the other white and abolish all the other whitenesses, which that's okay to say because they're white. So I'm allowed to say that on YouTube. And and just kind of like how the borders don't have any power now, just like move all the move the capital to Tennessee, to Nashville, and just like make Vanderbilt University the main Harvard, and just like make Harvard a community college. And yeah, so that should work. So the question is just, I mean, at the end of the day, like you basically just have to get the right people in power, and then they have to perpetuate their own power, and it's as simple as that. So the question is like, how do you do that to begin with? And I don't think the answer is do nothing. My answer right now is make money. Like if you're based, make money. Like we need money. Everything takes money. Like everything you look at in history, they hardly ever talk about funding. Um, like feminism is a great example. The story there is that all these women just rose up or whatever, like in the late 19th century, and were just like, we want to vote, and they didn't have any money, and they just marched the streets, and then they were listened to, and then we got the 19th Amendment. Well, it turns out there's this book that expertly debunks that, called Funding Feminism, and it was actually written by a radical feminist because they're always shooting themselves in the foot. And so I recommend that everyone read that. Um, and it just talks about how, yeah, actually it came from these like Puritan women who were like really egalitarian, who got all this money from their rich husbands, and then they just funded all of this stuff, and then that's how we got like first wave feminism. And yeah.
I mean, you have these women in the Seneca Falls Convention, the sort of Puritans or post-Puritans and Quakers, liberal Christians. I mean, it sounds like you're sort of agreeing with Moldbug there, right? The Puritan hypothesis.
I'm agreeing with Kevin McDonald's version of the uh, white elite problem, where you have like at least 50% of the elite right now are like white Gentiles, but they're like all really like gross and stuff, and like not based at all, and like even like the Republican elite, um, who are like maybe like 80% to like the Democrats like 30 or 40% like white Gentile ratio. They're like really gross, and you get people like James Lindsay, um, who I got blocked by on Twitter because I call him stupid, by the way. So it's funny that he reads tweets from accounts with 300 followers. But
Dude, he's so
um,
stupid.
yeah, and you get these people talking about Hegelian post-Marxist Gnosticism or whatever, and it's just like it's all nonsense. And there's an issue with the white elite. The other section of the elite, I used to read about and stuff, and I pretty much, that's kind of like a closed question in my mind, as to what's going on there, and I think that that's kind of the source. You can kind of split up. I think the white part of the elite is responsible for like feminism, and the other section of the elite is, responsible for like anti-whiteness and stuff, because like white people never hated themselves, so that has to come from like somewhere else. But then you still have all this other stuff, and so yeah, to some degree, some like poetic ideal of the Puritan hypothesis has to be correct. There's something like self-hating naturally about white Gentiles, and it does almost seem to be like a very specific type, because like other ethnicities don't have this issue. Like Italians are not that bad, borderers are not that bad. It is almost just like these Puritans who went to Massachusetts, and Massachusetts has always been really bad about it. And you can look at like how people vote, and you can look at like, Massachusetts, which is like, I think mostly white people, and they're like always Democrat, and it's compared to like the South and stuff. And it's just like, yeah, so some version of the Puritan hypothesis has to be correct, but at the end of the day, it's not this weird gene denying memetics version where it's like this idea that's like passed down. And the Puritans might not even exist anymore. It's unclear how much they've interbred. When you recognize that, the Puritanism isn't like a meme that exists in their brains, and these are just like just people who are totally blank slates or whatever. Then you have to
Oh
grapple
no,
with
it was
the
self-selecting. You had Puritans who went back from America to England to find sort of, worthy, noble, and pious people to come and live in their communities, right? So it's definitely to some degree genetic, but continue.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. Um, well, I mean,
I mean,
Moldbug never says that. He totally avoids that question, and that's kind of my one of my main issues with him is he doesn't seem to really have any interest in being like rigorous to the point where he's like, what's the material basis. He just kind of uncritically spews this like Dawkinsonian, like very liberal. I call memetics a flat out like liberal theory, and I actually consider Moldbug to be almost like a dark liberal or something, because like everything, like he pattern matches so well. He's like, yeah, I'm against progressives and stuff, and then he's just like spewing like this memetic stuff, and the guy's like an atheist, and he never talks about any like higher sense of morality, which is actually, I've been doing a lot of thinking recently about what separates the left and the right. And it almost seems to be like, leftisms are like these empowerment movements where they just want to give themselves power, and rightisms are movements where there's actually some higher ideal. And Moldbug doesn't seem to have any higher ideal, so it really almost looks like it pattern matches for me to a form of leftism. It's just like a really like bizarre, like mutated form of leftism that's like against the current hegemonic form, but it's almost just like an empowerment movement for like these Silicon Valley tech billionaires that Moldbug wants to ultimately rule. He wants like the Peter Thiels of the world to rule over these little like Confederate um, feudalist, you know, patches of land or whatever. And it's like, which all the people who love Moldbug even hear that, and they're like, oh, that's ridiculous. And I hear it all the time from these people who totally go hard for Moldbug. Um, they say, oh, his analysis is great, but his prescriptions are horrible. His prescriptions are bad. But it's like, your analysis is your prescriptions, and if there's something so wrong with your prescriptions, there's probably something wrong with your analysis. Yeah.
I mean,
So
there's a
yeah.
lot to cover there. But I think just to get back to the whole sort of white elite theory, I think, yeah. So Albion Seed, if we just go back to that, we have the borderers, right, who come from the Anglo-Scottish border. They go to America, and the idea is they become sort of, gun-toting, libertarian, freedom, a high time preference, just these sort of, sort of chads in the Appalachian Mountains. The other three groups are the Quakers and the Puritans, who have sort of touched on, but the final group are the Cavaliers. And you can even track this. It's interesting because they sort of come over after the Civil War, the English Civil War, when the Cavaliers are sort of stripped of their political power, when Cromwell takes control, and they establish the sort of slave-owning aristocracy, that elite culture that we sort of know in the South. And they name their states after the king and after monarchs. It's like Virginia after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth, and Carolina after King Charles. So this culture, I think, sort of the borderers perhaps ruling. I think Moldbug in one podcast has mentioned that no, the borderers shouldn't rule, but they should kind of be left alone to do what they want. I think he'd be more sympathetic to these southern elites. He has recommended George Fitzhugh, who was a reactionary southern author. So I think that's where we're going to find our sort of future reactionary elite. I mean, you find even in these people a sort of liberal strain, right? Robert E. Lee says slavery is a bad thing, but it's necessary for the moral instruction of black people, and they're better here than they are in Africa. So it's not like sort of grog brain sort of optimized behavior. I'm just going to dominate my foes and preserve my in group. It's sort of it's a reasoned perspective. So that definitely does exist still. I'm getting a bit of an echo. Is that me or is that you?
I don't hear an echo. I don't know.
Okay, we'll try muting yourself in between chats to see if that helps. But yeah, something naturally self-hating about white Gentiles, I don't know. Yeah, perhaps some extent, sure. But I think this is where Moldbug's sort of right. If you are the kind of person, the kind of white person in America, sort of forming this new culture, this new idea of politics, you get to choose what kind of church you're in. I mean, obviously the Mormons get kicked out, but there's a relative freedom to identify with that sort of culture. And so I think there is obviously genes play a part. Moldbug wouldn't deny that he's big sort of human biodiversity supporter, doesn't believe in the sort of he believes in neurological differences, right, between different groups of people. But I think that there is definitely an incentive, just in some regard. I mean, like the abolitionists, they're not there through some sort of economic incentive. At least I don't think so. It doesn't really benefit them to start this holy crusade against Southern society. But there's the scratch. There's there's a scratch. There's a sort of itch to for power that they want to sort of wield this influence over the South. So I think there is something to be said there for the power impulse, the power incentive as a driving force of this process. I think that's pretty much what I was going to say. You might have made one point at the end that I can't quite recall, but I mean, what do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I like how you mentioned what I call Orwellian motivation theory. And I mean, generally, I agreed with most of what you said, except for the last mention of Orwellian motivation theory as to like what motivated abolitionists and others. I'm not sure. That's another thing that Moldbug really see. And well, hold on. By Orwellian motivation theory, I just mean like the idea that that power is the end itself. That there's no like end to power. That the point of gaining power is just to have power. That's what Orwell advances in 1984, and that's pretty much what Moldbug's saying. And he's very clearly influenced by Orwell. Yeah, and so the idea is that these people just want to empower themselves. That I mean, that might seem kind of compelling, but I mean, the issue is that they definitely seem to have some sort of like positive substance as to what they want to accomplish. They want to when you're an abolitionist, you definitely want to do something. It's not just about empowering yourself. Um, so I'm not actually sure what motivated the abolitionists. That's something that I want to look at. I have all these projects that I need to do where I'm just looking at like the genesis of these different like leftist movements, especially in America, but also
Oh no, I
overseas,
mean
that I wish
that's
Moldbug
just
would have done. Like,
that's me. I mean,
yeah,
that's pretty much anyone who's in these circles, right? So much to read, so much to look at.
yeah, and I wish Moldbug would have done this, and I just always find it very frustrating that Moldbug just jumps to conclusions and doesn't give any details, and he writes so much, but there's not a lot of actual, uh, like the density of his writing is very low. Like you can read a lot of words that he writes and not really know anything, and it's just kind of a shame that we don't have like a comprehensive view of like the details of what actually was going on with the abolitionists and what was going on with the feminists and how that differs, and then the Civil Rights Act and just all these different things, and then like wokeism and like who the specific people are. My big thing with historical analysis is uh, you have to look at who the specific people are behind every single event. You can't, like, so many historians, like professional historians, are just lazy, and they break a rule that I have coined, where I say ideas can't explain ideas, ideas can't explain events, events can't explain ideas, and events can't explain events. Only people can explain ideas and events. Um, but so many historical analyses, including Moldbug's own analyses, break that rule, and they say, uh, and then Puritanism caused all of these policies to change. Yeah, and then the idea of abolitionism freed the slaves, and then yeah, or and then because the slaves were freed, therefore, yeah, the Civil Rights Act happened like 100 years later, and it's like, no, absolutely not. You have to look at the details. You have to look at the specific people, and then you might be able to draw similar conclusions, but only when you actually do the work and look.
I mean, sure, but that's a difficult task to identify all the different sort of people involved, right? I mean, you can't look at a battle, some sort of military historian, and say, oh, well, this individual did this and that caused that. You have to use a broad brush sometimes, which Morbug does deliberately.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's probably the easiest to do that with a battle. War battles, is not really what I'm talking about. But at the end of the day, with a battle, unless it's totally classified, you should actually be able to draw a pretty clear line, showing who actually ordered the battle and who commanded it, and who was there, and like what the chain of command was. Like which general decided it was a good idea. Did the president sign off on the battle? Who initiated this military operation? You can look at that. So hypothetically, just say you were looking at like a failed battle that just seemed like a really bad idea. Um, like a lot of historians at like Stanford, and Harvard, and all these like Ivy League places and Moldbug, um, they might just flat out say there was an ideology of blah 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 in the military, and that led to this horrible battle that so and so lost, and they lost because of their ideology at the end. And they would somehow just say that for like 300 words, when like the reality is that what they need to do, and again, this is actually easiest to do in the military as long as you're not dealing with like classified operations or something. They need to look at, okay, this battle was a disaster. Who ordered the battle? Well, it turns out that like it was ordered from the top down. It was like the president and the uh, his generals or whatever, and they sat and talked about it, and they ordered it, and then so and so commanded it. This specific general commanded the battle, and uh, I'm going to identify these key decisions that he made that maybe lost the battle and whatever. And then I'm going to, say, you know, those decisions sucked. Why would he make those decisions? Well, maybe those decisions were clearly influenced by this conviction of this specific general. And, and then maybe the others shared that conviction when they decided to engage in the operation, maybe not. And you can like do like a biographical history and try to figure that out, and then you could make like a very specific conclusion, as and you could say like, yeah, the U.S. lost that battle because this general and maybe these other people um, had this horrible idea of you know how to wage war or whatever, and it was totally flawed, and so they made these horrible decisions. And then also you could potentially say, you could go way back and say, well, where did that idea come from? But it's just like I don't see that in Moldbug, and I don't see that in a lot of histories. And like you said, that's difficult. But I mean, like writing should be difficult, or else it's probably not worth much. When I read a lot of Moldbug, It seems clear to me that he's really just like talking out of his ass. And um, you look at UR, and he was posting a huge essay every 2 days. I think you can look at the dates, and it's just ridiculous how much he wrote, and inevitably, he's just not smart enough. He's obviously a very smart man, but he's just not smart enough. He's just not well read enough at the point at which he starts UR for that to really pay off in an absolute sense. Now, he built a following somehow because apparently not everyone appreciates uh, the things I appreciate. And so I guess materially speaking, it worked for him to post every day. But in like an absolute like in the platonic form of writing quality, it didn't work out. Like so much of what he wrote could have been so much better. The dude really should have used, and he still has time to do this because he's still writing, and I still don't see him doing this, and it's just so sad to me. He really should be, you know, producing like these uh, works that are just like really revealing and really well researched, and he's not. And I feel like at some point that's going to bite him. At some point, people are probably going to forget about him. He's popular right now, but I mean, is Moldbug the kind of person who will be read in 100 years? I'm not sure on that. I definitely don't know that people will bother to go through even like a majority of what he wrote. Um, it depends on what historical events happen. If NRX people ever actually do anything, if the people who like Moldbug really take his clear pill stuff seriously, then nobody will read Moldbug in 100 plus years, because people who read Moldbug will never be historically significant even. And yeah, and that could all be different if Moldbug was just more like even Marx. Like Marx wrote Das Kapital, and it's a serious like economic analysis. And of course, all these economists say Marxist economics are stupid, but I mean, like, it's well researched, and consequently people still read Marx. And obviously Marx was a revolutionary, so people did things in his name as well. And I just don't see anything working out for Moldbug's legacy specifically, and it's sad. Like, that's really he should really um listen when I and like other people say that, if he cares about like being remembered or anything like that, because he's really shooting himself in the foot with the way he writes, and with his like pacifism or whatever. He's doing the complete opposite of this similar leftist personality that was Karl Marx. And I think he's gonna end up in the opposite place where nobody remembers him. People will still read Marx. I have Marx on my reading list. I'm not a leftist at all. I'm not a Marxist at all. He's still important to read. Um, and I feel like I don't even need to read any more Moldbug than what I've read, and I've only read like a few of his writings, and it's yeah.
Well, I think there's great utility in the concepts that he creates. I think the cathedral is useful, and I think that the rest of his stuff is good. I wouldn't recommend it to hardcore rightist or conservative, whatever. Maybe sort of normally conservative, but I think it has most utility for libertarians, right, or progressives. Moldbug was one of the first things that I read as a progressive, and it just sort of it all clicked for me. It was a long process, and so I respect the fact that it was written how it was, because if it wasn't, I might have sort of taken a lot longer to digest the sort of information that I was being given at the time. It might have been more shocking, but some of his style sort of resonated with me as a progressive. But I
You
think
might
in
be.
terms of his prescriptions, oh yeah, continue.
I just wanted to say real quick, you might be right. I hear that a lot. I've always been critical of that, but I do wonder how many Moldbuggers were former progressives. I was never a progressive. I've always like my um, immediate like impulse is like a form of like paleo conservatism. I've been that way since like a very early age, so I've never needed Moldbug. So I do wonder. One of the first things I notice about Moldbug is it's very um, you know he's descended from CPUSA grandparents, and he is of a specific ethnicity. I don't know what his Gentile side actually is. He might even be a Puritan, and so it does like I was saying earlier, NRX almost seems like a form of leftism, so maybe it does appeal a lot to um, like people who were predisposed to progressivism, and so in that way it could be a net positive for the right. So I'm not sure, but
Well, the whole idea of Moldbug's sort of original Formalist Manifesto is how do you remove violence from society? And this is something that pretty much anyone can agree on, unless you're some sort of, Bronze Age like mindset, Mishima, whatever, Silent Steel warrior guy. But anyone reading that is going to immediately agree with the premise, and that's why I agree that I think you said earlier, Moldbug is a dark liberal or whatever. I mean, yeah, eradicating violence is a sort of liberal premise. It's not based on making society Christian or returning some sort of order. No, it's just about the NAP or whatever. But building on those conclusions, or sorry, building on that premise, leads you to certain reactionary conclusions. And when you sort of read this history and it becomes clear, it becomes it's a much easier red pill than perhaps others, and it's delivered in a way that's easy to swallow. Moldbug's style isn't for everyone, but I was quite fond of it when I was reading it for the first time. Although it does get tiresome sometimes, but yeah, his idea of pacifism, I mean, it's really hard to say. I mean, what did you say? Get rich, make money. That's how you succeed. Well, I think that doesn't exactly fall out of the scope of the clear pill, right? It just means don't agitate in the way that leftists do. When a leftist riot happens, Black Lives Matter, you get sort of media sensation and influence and power and whatever. There's interest, there's buzz. But when you get Capitol Hill riot, it's like nothing happens, and actually the state then sort of starts what they started doing now, like setting up offices all around the country for the sort of some sort of military force. I'm not sure exactly, but I saw it this morning on Twitter. It won't work in your favor. I disagree with the whole sort of populist right thing. It's a complete dead end, and even if it does work, sure, you have this sort of bizarre like demagogue fascist state, which I can almost guarantee is going to have some side effects which can be pretty terrible for society. I mean, there's not much you can do at this point apart from just brutalize public opinion more and just generally sort of contribute to decay. You have to have a full restoration, which is something I entirely agree with. The sort of NRX project. It's very vague, but it's like the classic NRX thing was become worthy, accept power, and then rule. And this should be achieved with the unity of the monarch, the leader, and the people, the democracy against the oligarchy, which should be fairly clean, in theory at least, and fairly bloodless. But I mean, I think that prescriptions, at this point are pretty hard to nail down, right? How can you say what's going to work and what's not going to work when we know that in the past there have been impassioned and powerful and, above all, very popular right-wing forces in society that were just taken down by the cathedral, by the sort of liberal oligarchy. And it's like, at this point, the right has very little, very little, to go on to say for itself. And it's at this point, I think that just taking the clear pill is the best option, right? I mean, what other choice do we have?
yeah. Well, I mean, insofar as the clear pill is literally do nothing, I mean, I think doing nothing is just like being complicit, and it's not good. I did like Moldbug's like original anti-versity idea. I feel like he's almost gotten worse as time goes on when it comes to his prescriptions, at least.
Yeah,
Because
it's
I
a
have all
shame
these
that the
popular,
anti never became like a real, formal entity. It would have been quite useful, I think.
because I do think like just in general building parallel institutions is what we should be doing, which is distinct from doing nothing. I totally agree with you that the rallies and stuff that does nothing. There's no point to it. Um, there's no point to rioting. All the right wingers who riot just go to jail. Rioting is like a sign of power and not actually like a way in which you gain any power. So I definitely think it's about, like I said, building infrastructure, which is kind of a subset of making money because it takes money to build that infrastructure. And a lot of that infrastructure might be, producing things, making right wing corporations, which are kind of illegal. They did that 60 years ago. It's actually kind of illegal these days to not have a really paused woke HR department in your corporation that hires a bunch of like trans people and stuff into, positions of power in your company. So they kind of almost have everything by the balls, and it's just not good. But I kind of thought just personally that it would be interesting to go out and like, and again, this takes money. This is why I'm saying like at the end of the day, like the number one thing base people need to do is make money. I think it would be interesting to have like enclaves of on like rural land where like it's kind of almost like a right wing commune, and base people can just go out there and like live out there and like train out there and stuff and like exit from society. And as society inevitably gets worse because it's ruled really horribly, uh, that could probably be like a successful recruitment tool where people are just like, yeah, I don't want to live around like really gross people in the cities. I'm gonna go try to like uh you know live an agrarian lifestyle and like do stuff like that. But yeah.
There's this really funny Guardian article about this journalist who goes to live with the Bruderhof for a few days. Have you heard of them?
Who?
The Bruderhof, which is this sort of Christian agrarian community in the south of England, and that everyone there lives like it's the 17th century, sort
Oh
of
yeah, so
uses
like the
traditional methods
Amish.
for everything. Yeah, like the Amish, and he's like, geez, like I mean, it's good here. It's nice. Everyone's so pleasant, and there's like roast dinners every day. A pot roast, and everyone uh, sort of gets along. And oh, they're homophobic, but I mean, he has this like serious bit at the middle of the article where he's like considering it, and it's like, it's not so bad actually. I could live here. So it's just like, maybe, but that's kind of different to making money, right? You have to sacrifice a lot. I mean, one thing I think epitomizes this is there was that thing on Twitter with that girl who pointed out that her mother was at the riot, and and this mother had told this girl not to go to the BLM riots, and just look at my hypocrite mum. And then the tweet blew up. You got hundreds of thousands of likes, and then she made a GoFundMe for her college, and she got her college paid for. And it's like, just betray your family and get your college paid for. It's like a perfect, it's just and it's like satanic really. But yeah, it's making money is difficult. But there's one interesting thing. I know that you dunked on Peter Thiel in your article, but the Thiel Fellowship is quite cool because what it does is it gives $100,000 to young people who want to sort of use their skills in an interesting way. They don't want to go to university, right? It might be even for college, but it's a 2-year program, and it sort of supports the Thiel Foundation's network of quote founders, investors, and scientists. And this is a good thing, I think, because some of his students, what he does is he just gives them like Carl Schmitt to read, and this sort of thing. Slowly red pills them, which I can see as a sort of fruitful start. This is the kind of thing that is kind of the only avenue that's really possible for any sort of right-wing network to form, I think.
Yeah, and I dunk on Thiel in a love-hate way because the issue is that Thiel is probably the most based billionaire right now that's at least semi-open about his actual views. Um, and it's not enough. He's like, I heard he's homosexual. I'm pretty sure that that's the case. I like
Yeah,
to call
he
him a
is, yeah.
vampire because he's really into like these bizarre blood transfusions because he's an immortalist. He wants to live forever. This stuff is just not right wing. He might read Carl Schmitt, but I mean, like, what kind of person is this? It's really gross, and it's just like, imagine if it's great to take as much money, I guess, as we can from him, but like at the end of the day, he's going to fund um, just like really like fundamentally like subversive people almost. And I kind of in my article, I'm a little bit more like brash and hyperbolic, but I do wonder sometimes how much of a subversive Moldbug is. I said earlier he might be a net positive if he's converting a lot of progressives into like NRX, but I wonder how many, like paleocon type people like me, uh, read the clear pill and are like, wow, this is really great. I think I'm going to do nothing now. And, genes aren't real. And it's just, the Puritan meme and all that. And it's almost like subversion. And, um,
Moldbug's
Kamado
never
is,
denied genes.
yeah. Well, he denies them implicitly. I know he pays lip service to HBD, but at the end of the day, like one of his early um, he had this weird class system, the BDH NOV or whatever. I forget what it was called. You probably know what I'm talking about, but it's kind of fallen out of favor. But it was one of his like bigger ideas, and it's just like this really like
or like the American car system.
yeah, the caste system, and it's just this really like tortured like discrete like boxing thing where he's basically just painting over race with like class, and he just flat out says like, yeah, the deletes are like Mexicans and stuff, but instead of just saying like they're Mexicans, he has to call them like a class, and it's just really it's not it's just not, and he he's also totally obscuring the 50% of the elite in that work, and it's just yeah. So and yeah, so he's never flat out just denied genes, but like when he's talking about memetics, he's denying genes. When he's talking about the Puritan mind virus or whatever, and Puritanism as like its own object mutating into progressivism, I'm pretty sure he literally says that. He's denying genetics when he says that, at least implicitly, and he never really and genetics are like huge. It's pretty much the core of what I think about because it like literally drives all of human behavior. And that's the big difference between like what's possible now with theorizing about power and what was possible 100 plus years ago when we had guys like Pareto, Mosca, de Juvenal. Um, that was before they knew what DNA was. That was before I think even Mendel was popular. That was before like Ronald Fisher. Um, that was like right around when Darwin came out. In the case of like Mosca writing in the late 19th century, they really didn't get all this genetic stuff explicitly. Now we have behavioral genetics, and we're getting molecular genetics studies confirming all this behavioral genetic stuff, and Moldbug just isn't using it. I have a tweet where I apply behavioral genetics to history and studying power, where I say all historical analysis must follow the following law: the variance of the its phenotypic variance, which is written like V subscript P equals V subscript G plus V subscript E plus V subscript GXE, which is just the behavioral genetics equation uh, that you use when you calculate heritability. And it's like the idea is that history is kind of just like a conflicts of, or not conflicts, but like um, a flux of varying phenotypes, and like you're seeing like phenotypical change um, when you see like policy changes and you see new ideologies, and so that's ultimately what we know from behavioral genetics is that's ultimately going to be change in genetics, and it's probably mostly going to be change in genetics, and it's also going to be change in environment over time, which was Marx's big idea. The historical materialism, he denied genes, but he said it was all variance in environment is what caused the unfolding of history. And so essentially, like what I'm working with right now is the idea that that's partially correct, but a lot of it is variance in the gene pool is responsible for the unfolding of history. And this is stuff that like just doesn't even cross Moldbug's mind. Um, as far as I can see, and it's just like my whole thing is that he like should be writing about this. Like that's what's out right now, and like Moldbug just isn't even on the forefront of knowledge right now in any way. And he could easily just be writing in like the 18th century, and he could be writing alongside Spinoza, and it would just kind of be like maybe like Machiavelli take two or something, and with all this like reasoning stuff, like, oh, here's my postulate about how yeah, God is like a brain and is literally everywhere and whatever, and no, I'm not going to refer to any specific scenarios because it's 1653 or whatever, and yeah, Moldbug is just literally behind the times. That's one way of
Uh,
phrasing my main critique.
I mean, sure, genes are important, but I think they are quite overstated in terms of effective, like politics or at least policy making. You can have like a group with amazing genes that still falls apart, right? Optimizing for genes, well, first it comes later. You have to sort of at least have a good process for optimizing for genes. I wouldn't want to give our current crop of leaders, this kind of power. But it doesn't matter how sort of valiant and noble and collectivist your people are. I mean, you can still like fall into chaos. You can still become stagnant. That's like the classic. If you're too sort of collectivist, you're too inward looking, you stagnate. Or if you do outward looking, you get this sort of advantage, but then eventually you sort of fragment apart. I think a lot of this can be mitigated with good politics, and that's the essence of Moldbug, right? It's like, monarchy is the most effective system because it provides the best incentive for, effective government. So it's quite neat, operates well. I don't think genes are honestly that important. At least, you can make the sort of argument that, okay, sure, but what about optimizing for X or Y, or how is our new neo-cameralist state going to look in terms of its eugenic policy? And that's a good question, but I don't think it's like central for understanding how we got here. It's just it's not that important.
Yeah, I mean, I flat out disagree. And also the funny thing is that I think in a monarchy, genes are of like hyper importance because you have one specific individual with a ton of power. And so, like the character like of that person, which is going to be mainly determined by their genetics, is going to be super important. Whereas, in a republic, you're ruled by an oligarchy, so it's just like the set of people. And um, my whole thing is just like, when their behavior changes, it's mostly due to a change in the gene pool of the oligarchy. And I'm not really talking about optimizing for genes. I'm talking about like descriptively, like the way like history unfolds um, via change in like the ruling gene pool and their environment. Essentially, like that's the whole uh, intuition from behavioral genetics is when you see an elite, when you see a country going from, like based to not based, what you have there per, like the elitists is an elite class that rules that country going from based to not based. And what you have there per behavioral genetics is a set of people, a gene pool going from based to not based. And potentially that could be due to environmental factors, but we know, like just in general from behavioral genetics, that it's probably going to be change in the gene pool that's causing the slide from baseness to not based. And I think that that's frankly what we see when you actually take a microscope and you look at what's going on. So I haven't actually begun looking at a lot of the not baseness beyond like the education stuff I was talking about earlier. I've kind of looked at the rise of feminism. I haven't looked at the rise of like simping for black people yet, but with feminism, you see what I'm saying. A You have like this environmental change where it sets up this change in the gene pool, and what you see is you have these women coming into power by inheriting this money from their husbands, who in turn got the money from an environmental change, um, which was industrialization, and so that change allowed like a different sort of person to gain power, which in turn precipitated the more radical change that caused feminism, which was the introduction of like women into the um, gene pool of the ruling class.
Well, I think I got to thank Sage here for being such a sort of productive commenter. I've enjoyed looking at messages, but I think he sort of raises a good point here with the focus on class. I mean, obviously the Puritans couldn't have done what they did without this class benefit. I believe that both the Puritans and the Quakers were fairly productive classes in their own right. With the Quakers, I think they lent to each other with like this sort of low interest rate, and so they were able to sort of form this this informal network. But I mean, I think we'll have to wait until you do your analysis, because I don't see us like agreeing on this point really at this point, sort of talking past each other. But
Yes, we should absolutely do a follow-up on this in like a year.
Okay, sure. I'll
Because
write it
yeah,
down in my notebook.
my foray into this topic is in its infantile stages currently, so I'm trying to lean on methodological disputes instead of just flat out saying no, Moldbug's wrong. And here's what the actual truth is. I'm trying to more so say that like Moldbug isn't necessarily wrong, but he hasn't proven any of what he's saying. But I have like slid into, well, here's my hot take based on my initial research. But yeah, also at Sage, I hear that a lot when people are defending Moldbug. But the thing is that um, a lot of the presence of Moldbug is not just appealing to a certain class of people. People will, like simp for him and post that picture of him in his leather jacket or whatever on Twitter, and I always find
Dude, he's
that
so
cringe.
cool.
And I always respond with a picture of him where it shows his recessed chin, and I'm like, yeah, he's so cool looking. He's like, okay, I don't want to slide into just straight up being mean and talking about physique when I'm not even a face fag, but it's a um, if you're gonna like aggrandize this guy's physique, it's not just aiming at. It definitely doesn't seem like it's aiming at progressives. It just seems like he's being aimed at like everyone, and I don't see him saying, "Oh, I'm only for progressives." I don't see him trying to limit himself. To whatever extent he might be a subverter, it's like Moldbug is a person. He's a cell within the body of society, and he's trying to replicate his mimetics. So he's trying to kind of replicate himself, and he has accumulated this mass of people who follow him. And the question is this mass benign or malignant? Is it going to spread beyond itself into functioning organs of the right, or is it just going to stay there and maybe like accumulate more progressives who were never like quote unquote functioning organs of the right anyway? And I'm not really sure. I don't really see a lot of reassuring signs that it's totally benign. He definitely tries to spread his ideas further into the right a lot, or at least his followers do. And I don't see him reach out to progressives that much anymore. He almost seems to have closed himself off. He's writing, when he wrote The Clear Pill, he seems to clearly be talking to the dissident right and not to progressives. He's just not talking to progressives anymore, actually. He had his open letter to progressives, but now his writings just definitely, seem to be consciously aimed at people further into the right. He doesn't really seem to care what liberals think anymore. And I wish I could mine some quotes, but I swear I've heard or I've read where he said this, like he's not a part of the establishment anymore. He's not talking to liberals anymore. He's writing a portrait of the gray prince for the new reactionary regime that's going to take over. Like that's what he says, and it just doesn't seem like he's confining himself in his growth. He seems like he's trying to spread into like the third positionist portion of the right and like other people and yeah.
Well, when he releases his book, maybe we can do a review of that or something. See if that clarifies anything, because we still haven't really talked about his lack of ethical sort of direction. Obviously, NRX doesn't prescribe anything apart from just create a structure in which you can have the most peace, right? I mean, I don't know if you want to get into that now because we're already at 90 minutes, but that's one issue that I think is totally valid. There's no like directive for any NRX person to sort of live well or have any sort of goal apart from somewhat merge NRX with another sort of moral framework, like I don't know, virtue ethics, or I see like a lot of tradcaths who are NRX adjacent, and maybe even some pagans. But I mean, that's definitely a flaw, I think, with his writing.
Yeah, yeah, like the distributist is a gigantic Moldbugger, which I always found ironic because Moldbug is, like this atheist half Jew, and I think he probably despises Catholicism. He just kind of gives me that vibe, which is,
I
beyond.
don't know. I think he at the beginning of his writing, he always talks about how he always like makes this kind of reference to homosexuality being like legal or accepted. It's like, oh, but that's a good thing. I'm not gay though. But now I think he's, I don't know, dialed it back a bit. It's really hard to tell because some part of Moldbug is quite untrustworthy. I mean, he doesn't, he's too smart for his own good, and don't know if I can exactly like trust everything he says. But in his recent podcast, he's like, I'm fond of the like traditional conservative. I mean, they're not my people, right? He's obviously, he knows he's not. He's like a Puritan sort of, Michelin, whatever, like boarding school, government employee, parents, like that sort of guy. But he does say that he has some compassion for the average redneck, which I don't know how true that is, but it doesn't really like matter in terms of the grand scope of his work, I think.
Yeah, I mean that's good if he likes, the average redneck. I find that positive, but I do, on top of him just straight up kind of seeming to shill for um pacifism when it comes to like the practical things that the right should do. Like you were saying, his silence on the good is worrying, and that's a big part of what makes me worry that he might be actually trying to subvert the right into this kind of like amoral um, mass of just like NRX people, on top of like his analysis of power, which I find to be lacking. It's like people who are like strictly into Moldbug are going to just be totally like kind of liberally amoral, and that's almost like when Moldbug writes so much and he doesn't say anything about the good. I find it hard to trust him as a person because like I don't know what he thinks the good is, right? Why isn't he talking about it when he has a platform? When he is, trying to lead this ideology, and he doesn't have anything to say about morality. I mean, come on, that's like a huge part. That's like everything almost. I mean, what even is his ethic? Is it still the nap, like in the Formless Manifesto, right? Is he just a
I
Napist?
believe it's something like Salus Populi Supreme. Salus Populi Suprema Lex, something like that. Health of the people, right? That's his sort of that's his good, and he said that a couple of times in his podcast.
Of the people? Is that what's the
So
translation?
Salus Populi Suprema Lex Esto. So it means the health of the people should be the supreme law. So I'll just put
I
that
mean,
in.
depending on how
Put
you
that in chat.
interpret that,
Just
that's
reference.
not that horrible. I mean, I don't know. Would you like okay?
No,
Because I
not
kind of
really.
wanted to bring this up with you. Your channel name is what was it? It's Ganon.
Capturing
Is
none.
yeah, capturing
I'd
non. I always
say
pronounce it
non just
Ganon,
because
but
it's. I know I don't know how you
yeah,
say it like, but I just think it just sounds better. Ganon is just a bit, I don't know, weird, and it's all dorky anyway. But yeah,
yeah.
continue.
So non. I'll just pronounce it non here to be consistent. That was coined by Nick Land, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or and who do you think like one of the
Yes.
who do you think the main who do you think are the main writers that try to advance the non thing? Because to me, like, I don't really follow a lot of the like um, other NRX people except for one, which would be Jim's blog, and he's the main writer that I know of that really preaches the gospel of non. And yeah, so do you read him? Have you heard of him?
Yeah, I read a bit of Jim. I know that at the beginning he used to be really big into natural rights, natural law. I think non, at least in the way that I understand it, is kind of different from that. But I haven't read like that much Jim.
Yeah, well, Jim has actually denounced Moldbug, and it seems to me that the non thing is actually oppositional to Moldbug. Moldbug does not. I don't believe Moldbug has ever recognized non or referred to non.
He hasn't.
Yeah, so it's not it. To me, my hot take is it really rhymes with just my thoughts on morality. My whole thing is I'm really into what I call life ethics, which is basically just like everything should be about the advancements of life because that's what is, that's what's here. My interpretation of Christianity is, of course, that Jesus is um, the living God. He's the God of life, and so for that reason, Christianity is essentially true, based and all of that. And Yeah, and to me, the non thing is the same thing, and non is essentially synonymous with like the God of the Bible. And this is totally oppositional to Moldbug, who's totally an atheist, and was an apist, and now is, I guess, for the vague notion of the good of the people. Um, and so the non thing, you get like yourself and like Jim and people who preach the non thing, which I like, but they call themselves NRX. And my hot thing is, even if it's not conscious, um, preaching non and saying you're NRX is actually potentially subverting the subverter. So if Moldbug is subverting, whether consciously or unconsciously, then by attaching on to like NRX and Moldbug, and then preaching like what I consider to be basically old-fashioned right-wingism, whereas NRX is potentially like actually a form of like dark liberalism or whatever, you're actually trying to subvert the subversion back into baseness, and I just find that to be cool. It's like a cool
Well,
thing to think about. But
it's kind of complicated. We could really, I mean, talk about this for ages, but I covered it in my most recent video, Capturing Non. But I think it does chime with Moldbug. I mean, the whole idea of non is this sort of originally by land, it was like a substitute for natural order, right? As in, if you do this, if your society degrades as such, then you'll be punished, and that's why you have to, maintain certain standards. But obviously, that was sort of elaborated upon and thought about more, and a lot of these sort of processes that exist in the world do not seek to uh, like or not exploit or take advantage of humanity's weakness and sort of promote a sort of more healthy living. In fact, they kind of dovetail into this sort of chaotic path. I'm not, in which you can sort of look at more in the video that I made, but like the point being that in some way you have to sort of redirect it, right? You can't just allow these forces of nature just to exist and manifest their sort of action, as you will, because personified in non. Enact this upon your society, you have to sort of capture it or redirect it. So ultimately, it does leave the question of, well, how do you redirect this? How do you, what is the good? It's not just a negation, right, of this sort of these forces, or of we're going to be in opposition to, like famine and war and poor genes, sort of, and poor memetics, all this sort of thing. Ultimately, the question is unresolved, at least in the NRX canon, of what you do here. And that's why I think that if I have any advice to anyone who is sort of watching this, it would be to use NRX as a sort of framework for understanding politics and a bit of history, but put it with something else that will sort of guide you ethically, because that is one of the primary issues that I think Moldbug has.
yeah, absolutely. To me, Moldbugian NRX though is fundamentally amoral. Just his silence is deafening. So you seem to be considering it kind of like a supplement, but to me, it's definitely like a transformation in the good direction. But I definitely think that people thinking about Moldbug should just be more aware of uh, the deafening silence of him on moral issues and the good and just generally being based. But yes.
This is also Kantbot's critique. I believe he had a go at Moldbug for liking Carlyle, but not reading any of the sort of German work that Carlyle translated into English, this sort of philosophical stuff and literature, because of course Moldbug doesn't touch on ethics whatsoever.
Yeah, I generally do agree
But if
with
that's
Kant.
everything, happy to sort of
Yeah.
no, continue. Sorry.
I was just gonna say he is kind of a law cow. I don't agree with um, most of everything of what
Oh
Kantbot
yeah,
says, but I think he's pretty much right on Moldbug and Peter Thiel. He bitches about Thiel a lot, and I think BAP is also funded by Thiel. And yeah, astroturfing on the right is also something that I think people listening to this should think about more. I'm not sure to what degree Moldbug is potentially astroturfed. BAP has gotten more based recently, but I definitely think that he was astroturfed. He had like articles about his book in the Atlantic or something really early on, ostensibly critiquing it, but that just exploded his popularity. And and he's like this bodybuilder, like kind of amoral bodybuilder type that's just like, dude, you should lift, and it's just kind of ineffectual. And
Do you know the story behind that Atlantic article? Or
I'm
it was
not sure.
written by Michael Anton, I believe, and it was Curtis Yarvin who gave Anton a copy of Bronze Age Mindset. So
Yeah, so there you go.
yeah, behind the scenes, there's an operation going on. But I mean, it's not. I don't really see much conspiracy there, but something to be on the
There's
lookout for, I
definitely
guess.
similarities. BAP is very much against any form of actual scholarship. The book opens. It's like, this is a book of exhortation. I don't do reading. I don't do empirical evidence. I don't even write. I dictated this book. So it's like,
Dude, it's based.
yeah, whatever.
He also supports, or rather, he counter signals like sort of these live public conferences as well, which I don't know. I don't really have many thoughts about. I'm talking about the Nick Fuentes AFPAC specifically.
Yeah, I
So
think
in that
Nick is more
regard,
based than BAP, honestly. I mean, BAP has been saying some cool things recently. He's counter signaling the mushroom meme, which I've taken on, which I find to be cringe because the mushroom is, of course, a symbol of generate. It's a generative symbol. It's kind of like a phallic symbol. It's a symbol of virility in life. Um, a mushroom takes dead mass and makes it live again, and so it's ultimately a symbol of life, and it's very based. And so all these people, who were collectively counter signaling the shroom like a day or two ago on Twitter were very sus to me. And it kind of started with BAP and then it spread to Zero HP, who might be AstroTurf. I kind of wrote an article about that, although he's pretty based on Twitter. And then it was like spreading to other people who were counter signaling the mushroom. So it's just, I don't know. It kind of gets into schizo um, territory. I was kind of posting some really like aggro tweets about how, what are all these people? Are they Indians at a shill center? Are they literally sitting in a call center or whatever? And their bosses are saying, counter signal the mushroom right now. It's too based. Yeah, I don't know about that, but there's something weird going on on
I like
Twitter.
this mushroom pill. It's compelling, actually. I was originally a skeptic, but you're kind of convincing me.
Yeah, you should definitely. We actually have a super secret society dedicated to advancing the mushroom as a far right hate symbol. It's anyone who embraces the shroom and has a shroom profile picture is invited. So I might have given away too much, but
Yeah, well, I'm not
so
changing mine anytime soon, so
oh, okay, that's
I think I'll
cringe.
just write that out. Yeah, sorry, I'm a real
I
person.
was
Okay, I don't just
joking
change my
with
profile picture every 10 seconds. That's on me. Anyway,
yeah. I need to
um,
settle on a real PFP. I don't know if I'll just keep the shroom or if that's like stupid, but
the shroom's good for now. I like the metaphor. Metaphor. You know, the semiotics is important, right? The symbol.
yeah, absolutely.
Um, but if that's it, that's all I have to say. So, if you've got anything else?
Yeah, I do have to go, but it's been a good talk.
Okay, yeah, definitely. Thank you very much for being here all this time and coming on my channel. Hopefully, at some point we can chat again. Everyone, check out Julius Branson's Substack and WordPress, and
Yeah.
follow him on
Well,
Twitter.
I started a YouTube channel yesterday because of this, and I figured YouTube video people would prefer to watch YouTube videos. So I actually dictated the brief Moldbug critique, and it's on my YouTube channel. So just Google Julius Branson YouTube, and you should be able to find it.
Okay, so thank you everyone for watching, and good evening and goodbye.